Hello and welcome. Today's webinar is Transportation Benefits of Polycentric Urban Form. My name is Brendan Williams. I'm the Research Program Administrator at Portland State University's Transportation Research and Education Center. TREC leads the National Institute for Transportation and Communities, one of the national university transportation centers funded by the U.S. Department of Transportation. NITC's research priority is improving mobility of people and goods to build strong communities. NITC consortium members are the University of Utah, University of Oregon, University of Arizona, University of Texas at Arlington, and Oregon Institute of Technology. Our presenters today are Dr. Reid Ewing. Reid Ewing directs the Metropolitan Research Center and is Distinguished Professor of City and Metropolitan Planning, Distinguished Chair for Resilient Places at the University of Utah. He is the Associate Editor of the Cities Journal. His recent article on COVID-19 and urban density, published in the Journal of American Planning Association, already has more than 37,000 views on the JAPA website, the second most in JAPA history. He also has the second most cited JAPA article, Travel in the Built Environment, a Meta-Analysis. Our other presenter is Sadegh Sabouri. He's a PhD student in the Metropolitan Planning, Policy, and Design program at the University of Utah. His research focuses on technology's impacts on transportation, ride sourcing services, and advanced data analytics in urban and transportation planning. His doctoral study focuses on the impact of the built environment, the adoption of ride sourcing services, and the impact of Uber availability on car ownership rates. Our upcoming events, we have our annual NITC reception at TRB. It's Thursday, January 28th from 4 to 5:30 Pacific time. We invite you to join us for a night of networking and a bit of fun with fellow transportation professionals. Our next webinar is Land Use and Transportation Policies for a Sustainable Future on February 9th. At 10 a.m. It's presented by Li-Meng Wang from Portland State University. On March 23rd at 10 a.m., we have the webinar Transit Impacts on Jobs, People, and Real Estate, presented by Arthur Nelson, Christy Currens, and Robert Hibbert from the University of Arizona. On April 6th at 10 a.m., we have the webinar Rethinking Streets During COVID, presented by Mark Schlossberg from the University of Oregon. Okay, so the presentation is going to be about 40 minutes long, and we're going to have 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. Feel free to submit your questions during the presentation. That'll help me prepared for the Q&A that'll follow, or wait till the end and submit them then. But anyways, we will have time to answer your questions. After the webinar, you're going to receive an email with the link to the video recording and presentation slides. If you are tracking professional development hours, this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. Instructions on how to redeem this credit will be included in the post-webinar email. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to our presenters. Okay.
Well, welcome everyone. I'm Reid Ewing. Sadegh Sabouri is my co-presenter. We're going to tag team. I'll present the first part, he will present the second, and so on. There are other people who have helped out on this project. They're listed under our names. Ken Park, for example, Tori Lyons were all instrumental. It was a big project. The funding sources were not just NITC, although NITC provided the bulk of the funding, but the Wasatch Front Regional Council, which is our MPO in Salt Lake City, UDOT, and UTA, the Utah Transit Authority, also helped fund the study. And we're interested in the whole idea. But basically, the way I see it is, we took two under research topics and put them together in one study. One of the topics is polycentric development, or the transportation benefits of polycentric development. Which is, I believe, under-researched, at least, from our literature review. That's what we concluded. The other is trip chaining, which was a big deal in the early 90s and it sort of dropped off the radar a little bit. Civil engineers are still doing some work on it, but planners not particularly. So we are looking at trip chaining, and Sadegh will present that research and our very interesting findings. So I'm going to start with this slide back to 2002, when we were among the first to measure sprawl. And we said sprawl involves four things. Sprawl is low density, sprawl is segregated land uses, sprawl is a sparse street network with lots of cul-de-sacs and curvilinear shape, and sprawl is a lack of strong activity centers. And it's activity centers that we're going to focus on in this presentation. So the original study, the 2002-2003 study, ultimately led to the NIH funding another study of sprawl in 2014, and a book, The Costs of Sprawl, which was published 2 years ago. Between 2003 and 2014, there were lots of studies of sprawl, some done by us, but others using our sprawl metrics as their independent variables. And we found that sprawl was related to traffic fatalities and poor air quality and high residential energy use, and the other things you can see in this listing. After 2014, we've studied other things like life expectancy has been related to sprawl. Life expectancy is lower in sprawling areas than it is in compact areas. Food deserts are more prevalent in sprawling areas than in compact areas. So a lot of research has been done using our metrics. And remember, and this is most important for today, the metrics incorporate this idea of centering or polycentric development, which we'll be talking a lot more about. This is just from the 2014 redo of our sprawl metrics or compactness metrics. And you can see that a lot of variables were used in principal component analysis to measure density, measure mixed use, measure measure centering and measuring street connectivity. So our definition of the center is the densest part of the region, characterized by compact and mixed-use development, well-connected by multimodal transportation networks, and having more job opportunities than the areas around them. And a polycentric development pattern is just one made up of multiple centers. And it's diagrammed in the lower right. You have basically a region of these centers, these dense employment centers with a mix of uses other than just employment, and then single-family neighborhoods typically around them. But it is very much a development pattern that emphasizes agglomeration economies from economics, the economics courses you've taken. So these centers provide agglomeration economies, and we are showing here some examples. This is from 1980 and 1990, subcentering a development. Those peaks. You have downtown San Francisco, which is the biggest peak, but then you have other peaks. Oakland is a peak, and all the way along the BART system, you get these subcenters in what is a polycentric pattern. This is a shot I took flying into Washington, D.C., and you can see that the single-family neighborhoods surrounding these centers at metro stations, the centers being mid and high rise, and of course, the single-family neighborhoods being low rise. This is the dominant paradigm in transportation planning today, regional transportation planning today. It's one, and Sadegh will talk more about that. It's one that has and designates centers across the region, and then connects them with high quality transit. And it is such a dominant development pattern that it's worth mentioning a couple times in this presentation. This is what most regions have as their vision for the future.
Hello, everyone. Before I start presenting this section, I would like to thank NITC for organizing this event and also funding our research. So in our final NITC report, we have different sections such as the literature review and examining polycentric development in RTPs, regional transportation plans, which is the foundation of development in each region. And then we try to define and identify centers in multiple regions in the US 28 to be specific. And then we try to quantify the benefits of polycentric development, and then assessing trip chaining efficiency or tour efficiency, which I'll describe later. And finally, qualitative case studies, which for today's presentation, we will only focus on Portland. So our review of regional transportation plans was, our reason for that was to see how each region is defining center, and what are their proposed methods for assessing transportation benefits of centers, and how they define qualitative and quantitative criteria for that. First thing that we realized was that among different types of centers, activity center was repeated more than other types of center. It was mentioned about 1,000 times in these 126 RTPs, followed by employment center, town center, and urban center. The next important thing was, as Reid mentioned, we realized that polycentric development is becoming a dominant development paradigm. in these regions in the US in general. And we realized that at 90% of these RTPs at least mention one type of center, which should be, these centers should be connected by high quality transit. But what's important here is that among these 90%, only 20% of them provide some quantitative criteria. So in general, one of the major issues is that they lack criteria regarding like minimum center densities, minimum population, employment, land areas, and so on. And even among these 20% that have provided some quantitative criteria, some of them are very broad. For instance, one region only talks about minimum population density, and that's all. But some other regions, like here, Chattanooga region, for instance, they provide very specific and detailed recommendation for their development. Like they have a hierarchy of centers like regional hub, community activity center, neighborhood activity center, and growth corridors. And they provide some criteria for the density, mixed use, maximum parking, building design, and so on. For instance, for the regional hub, as you can see, the residential density should be 20 to 50 dwelling units per acre, and also 50 to 100 jobs per acre for the employment density. But what's important is that we were not able to find a single region, a single RTP that quantifies the transportation benefits of centers. So in our study, we needed to first identify centers. And we have 28 diverse regions in the US in our data set. And these 28 regions are the ones that over the past years, we tried to compile their household travel survey data. And we started by first identifying or finding candidate of central business districts, CBDs, using a very popular and common technique called local Mern's eye. And we had some exclusion criteria, such as a cluster should not be more than 75% in any single employment sector, because that would be a large organization like a university campus, like hospital or a mall, and so on. And then once we identified CBDs, we try to identify subcenters, employment subcenters, based on the location of the CBDs and also the employment density peaks. And we use a technique called geographically weighted regression, or GWR, which if you want to know more about these methods and how we use them, please read our report. And finally, we validated this location of centers and subcenters by Wasatch Choice 2050. This is the vision of this our home region, Salt Lake region. Currently we have a monocentric development pattern, but it is anticipated to be a polycentric development pattern with a stronger CBD and also subcenters. Overall, we were able to identify 589 centers and subcenters in these 28 regions. So in terms of validation, on the left side, you are seeing Wasatch Choice 2050. On the middle, you can see the local employment density peaks, which comes from our local Mern's eye and GWR techniques that we used. And on the right side, you are seeing the mixed-use development. Here, we interviewed local planners in our region and asked them to provide us the boundary of their mixed-use districts or developments, and which is just 2 or more uses, like residential and commercial, connected by local streets. And if we put these two together, the middle map and the right map, we see that it will give us something similar to the Wasatch Choice 2050. And that was our validation test.
Yeah, so in terms of validation, our region is one of the many that has a polycentric vision for the region. Right now, as Sadegh mentioned, we're monocentric. It's really just downtown is the only place, if you fly into Salt Lake City to go skiing, maybe you will see one high-rise area and the rest looks fairly low density. But in time, Sandy, which is a suburban community south of Salt Lake, wants to have a high-rise center, downtown Sandy, and there are that aspiration to have a center has led to the Wasatch Choice 2050 vision. All of those shaded areas are designated ultimately for higher density development. So moving on, this is our data set. City mentioned that we've been compiling data from household travel surveys now for about a decade. We've been collecting it, and we've related household travel records to the D variables, density, diversity, design, etc. We'll talk more about that. For centers, for block groups, for TAZs, for household buffers around households, and so on. In this particular study, you can see the number of centers in each of the regions that we identified and the number of trip ends within the centers. We've got a very rich database after 10 years of collecting. Here they are, and they're the regions that are among the 28, and they are varied. Boston, one end of the spectrum, Atlanta at the other sprawling end of the spectrum, Houston at the sprawling end, Portland at the more, and Seattle at the more compact end of the spectrum. And just as an aside, we got the travel data typically under a confidentiality arrangements with MPOs from their surveys. So here are the D variables. You're all familiar with them. I'll go over them very quickly. They are density, development density, land use diversity, street network design, destination accessibility, and distance to transit. And we've already, at this point in the study, identified CBDs and subcenters within the region. And now we're going to relate travel outcomes to the presence of centers. When you compare household travel records for households living in centers to those living outside, you find that there is much higher, significantly higher VMT outside centers than within centers. There are more transit trips, as you'd expect, in centers, and more walk trips in centers. Now, that's when you do a gross comparison of 1,506 households that reside within centers to the other 78,000 that in our database that are outside centers. We used propensity score matching to match households inside and outside centers, for matching for various characteristics. And we again find that VMT is much significantly lower for households living within centers. Walk trips also are higher for households living within centers rather than those outside. And this is, to our knowledge, the first study that has done anything like this, identifying centers and then looking at household travel characteristics to see if they're different, and they are different. And it's strong, it provides strong support for that dominant paradigm of centers across a metropolitan area, centers and subcenters, and that it actually produces positive transportation impacts. We also, because we wanted to give our MPO quantitative criteria for designating centers, we also use the generalized additive model, which does nonlinear curve fitting to see at what densities and mixes and so on, the D variables, you get positive transportation impacts. So we ran GAM for mode choice and VMT, and this is what our results look like. You can see at the upper left, these are GAM plots between D variables and the likelihood of walk mode choice, or the proportion of walk trips. And you can see there's a local peak at about 20,000 persons, that's jobs and residents per square mile, and then another peak at about 40,000. And we did this for job population balance and entropy and intersection density and percentage of four-way intersections and transit stop density and percentage of employment within 10 minutes by auto and percentage of employment within 30 minutes by transit. So we related each of the Ds to outcomes. That was walk mode choice. This is something similar for transit mode choice, and you can see there's again a peak for transit mode choice around 20,000 persons per square mile. And VMT, of course, we're not interested in the peak VMT. We want the lowest VMT and intersection density. For example, VMT is lowest at about 300 intersections per square mile in this nonlinear regression. So these are the values looking at those GAM charts, we came up with for our region. And actually, since it's based on 28 regions worth of data, these would apply to other regions as well. So, excuse me, a region should have 10 to 25,000 per center in a region should have 10 to 25,000 persons per square mile, depending on the center, the type of center. And you can see the others. In all cases, we provided guidelines. We did that because, as Sadegh noted, there isn't a lot of in the regional transportation plans we reviewed. There isn't a lot of empirical justification for that 20% of plans that provide new metrics and numbers to define centers. So that's what we're doing. We're saying that as regions define their centers, they should try to achieve these levels of activity density and other things.
So next, we try to assess trip chaining efficiency in centers. But what is a trip chain or a travel tour? A trip chain or travel tour is just a sequence of trips that begins and ends at home, also known as home-to-home loop. In this figure, a simple tour would consist of only one stop, meaning that, for instance, an individual goes from home to coffee shop and then goes back home. That would be a simple tour. But a complex tour, same as this figure, consists of multiple stops and multiple trips. So here a person first goes to coffee shop, then work, then daycare center, then going back home. That would be just one single tour. There are so many different characteristics that impact the tour complexity as well as transportation modes of travel, such as household structure and personal characteristics, such as household income, the number of vehicles they own, and so on. and also their residential and transportation preferences, as well as built environment. But here we are focusing on one special kind of built environment known as centers. As Reid mentioned, there is a literature on trip chaining, but mostly old. Also, there is a literature on polycentric development, less emphasized on transportation benefits. But to our knowledge, there isn't any study that tries to combine these two together and assess the trip chaining efficiency. But by efficiency, what we mean, which we adopted from other previous studies, is just the higher tours that consist of more sustainable modes of transportation. So the higher the proportion of walk, bike, or transit trips, the more efficient the trip chain. And also the shorter distance of trips by auto, the more efficient the trip chain. We admit when we talk about efficiency, the first thing that comes to mind is about travel, tour cost, or energy, and all these things. But here, by efficiency, we mean just having more sustainable modes of transportation. But the important question here is that why are we focusing on trip chaining? Why is it important to consider tour as a basis of our analysis rather than just focusing on trips? So there are a vast body of literature discussing that in order to capture the true behavior of individuals, we cannot analyze trips in isolation. Obviously, individuals think about all the trips that they are going to make when they go out of their home. It is very unlikely that an individual uses his vehicle to go to work and then use transit to go back home. So based on these things, we see a new trend in transportation modeling as well, which is called tour-based modeling. And as Frank and colleagues said, tour-based modeling more closely matches the way in which travel decisions are actually made, and so is more likely to capture true behavioral causality. The current gaps are explained. None of the previous research focused on centers, the trip chaining efficiency in centers, and also we see some mixed results in terms of the relationship between tour patterns and the built environment. So our research question here is that are tours associated with centers more efficient than ones that are completely outside a center? And we argue that if our expectations are correct, this would be the strongest evidence yet produced on the transportation benefits of polycentric development. So I already explained how we identified our centers. Now we go back to our household travel survey for each region. We try to identify all tours in these surveys, but we had some exclusion criteria. First, we completely removed a tour that if we did not have an XY coordinates of even one single trip associated with that tour. So imagine a tour consists of 6 trips going from home to coffee shop to work and so on. If we did not have the XY coordinates of one single stop, we completely removed that tour. And also we removed the tours that did not start or end at home, because our definition was a tour is a home-to-home loop. Overall, we had 28 regions, and 96% of our households had at least one vehicle, and we had about 680,000 trips nested within 235,000 tours. And also, as I mentioned, we had 589 centers. So next, we tried to distinguish tours. So we had 3 different tour types. Tours that are within a center, meaning that all the trips associated with that tour are inside a center. Also, another type was outside of a center, meaning that all the trips associated with that tour are outside a center, and also hybrid. Some of the trips are inside within a center, some of them are outside a center. And then we ran the one-way analysis of variance and also compounded post-hoc test. These are all of our comparisons are significant, statistically significant at 0.01 level, and we realized our results show that tour type 1 consists of more sustainable modes of transportation, the share of sustainable modes of transportation is higher for tours within a center. In terms of walk share, as you can see, type 1, walk share, bike share, and transit share, type 1 has the highest percentage. And then in terms of auto share and VMT per trips, as expected, these values are higher for tours outside of the center. And finally, on the last column, we see chain length, and chain length is just the number of trips associated with each tour. And tour type 2 has a higher chain length, meaning that these types of tours are more complex than others. This slide shows the mean values of walk share and bike share. And as you can see, tour type 1 within a center, the walk share is more than 50%. So more than 50% of trips associated with this type of tour are walk trips. And for the hybrid and outside of the center, this value is something between 6 to 8%. In terms of bike share, again, highest share for within a center, about 3.5%, and for hybrid and outside of the center, it's about 1%. And these are the transit share, again, same pattern, but for auto share and with VMT per trip, it's vice versa, meaning outside of the center, more than 80%. The auto share is more than 80%, and for the chain length, higher for hybrid.
Okay, so it's all well and good to say that centers produce transportation benefits, but the literature is on the built environment and travel, as many of you know from the 2010 JAP article I wrote with Robert Cervero. We know that the D variables affect travel outcomes, but how do you produce the D variables that provide the transportation benefits? And the literature is much weaker on how to affect the built environment than it is the effects of the built environment on travel. So we have 4 detailed case studies in our report. These are case studies of 4 different regions: Portland, Seattle, Denver, and Minneapolis-St. Paul. And each one is a separate chapter, and in each case we interviewed and reviewed documentation for the transit operator, for the MPO, and for the central city of that particular region. So this is the Portland City Comprehensive Plan, 2035 Comprehensive Plan, and you can see those centers are the red dots and squares and so on. And the right hand is maybe stands out a little better in the right hand figure than the left hand figure. So it is a polycentric plan, their comprehensive plan. They seek to achieve polycentrism by identifying levels of density as well as intensity of mixed-use development that they're striving for in these centers, creating urban renewal districts, having a zoning map which designates mixed-use commercial and residential zones that allow adequate density. So they use zoning and have parking policies that promote polycentric development within the city, and look for the operation of travel demand management programs as another characteristic that defines centers. And this is a long, drawn-out slide. Just suffice it to say that they are trying to channel amenities like arts and culture and government services into their centers. So that's one of the techniques they're using to promote polycentric development. When you locate a government office building, make sure it's in a center rather than outside, as an example. Yeah, many of you are familiar with the 2040 metro region, Portland metro region vision or concept plan. Those red circles, the largest one being downtown Portland, but lots of other circles are centers that were designated in the 1990s as where they wanted to encourage growth and development and density. They have a functional plan which I was not aware of before we did this study, but it operationalizes what's in their 2040 concept plan, calls for minimum housing density within centers, recommends specific levels and types of mixed-use development. This is across the region. So you've got the city of Portland with polycentric development, and then you have the region with polycentric development including not only Portland, but Beaverton and Hillsborough and Gresham and other communities, which are regional centers in their hierarchy of centers. And here are some metrics associated with the different centers. Area, amenities, people per acre, rising from in a less smaller center from 30 persons per acre to 223 or 33, excuse me, persons per acre in downtown Portland. So again, operationalizing the D variables for their centers, and then also to help implement the polycentric development pattern in their vision. They have a TOD program. They've got their State of the Centers report, which is put out periodically. They provide grants to do planning for polycentric development, and have Title VI Center functional plan, first implemented by Portland Metro. And then finally, the transit agency, the last of the three that we interviewed and studied documentation for. The transit agency is, of course, TriMet, and their plans provide for connected centers with high quality transit. So the dominant paradigm we talked about before is in part implemented by their transit operator, TriMet. The other, as I said, we have 4 case studies. Each of them are separate chapters. We're putting them together into a paper right now. And here are the other centers. And I forgot to thank Brendan when we first started presenting. Thank him for the support he's given us and for the nice introductions he gave us. And we're now ready for questions and answers.
Great, Reid. So thank you for the presentation. We do have a few questions already, so that's great, and we're going to address them. If you have questions, please, now is the time to submit them. We have about 15 minutes, and we're going to try and cover them. So I think I'll start with one of the larger scope question, and that's dealing with the partnerships and what MPOs and regional transit organizations can do with this research, Reid, and if you have any particular examples.
Well, I think there are examples in all 4 of our case study regions. When we started our interviews, we contacted, for example, the MPO and said, who do you work with at the transit agency, and who would be a good person or people to interview in the city? So there's good communication between MPOs, transit operators, and cities in realizing the polycentric development vision for the region. And I think we probably almost overemphasize the fact that when you read regional transportation plans, you see examples of polycentric development, and the way we do it here, and I'm sure the way it's done most places, is through the MPO. We have a representation of across the region, of cities across the region, in the creation of our regional transportation plan. So it wasn't a bunch of analysts at the MPO sitting in a room and saying, I think we'd like a center here in downtown Sandy, and let's put one here in Daybreak. All of this was done in coordination with local governments and with the transit operator UTA. And Sadegh reminded me to mention that we published our first paper, which covered everything except the trip chaining analysis in JAPA about a year ago. This has been a long project, and we have a paper under revise and resubmit in cities with our trip chaining analysis. So watch for those. You can already find the JAPA paper. It's been published, and hopefully cities will be accepting our paper soon and publishing it.
Great. So in reading the report, I believe I might have the details wrong, but I believe you, in the start, there was a mention about how Europe has the polycentric development, and there's good examples. Does that also apply to, would you say, Canada? Are these places you've looked at? And
yeah, great question. Yeah, we did mention Europe as having, in many of the countries, a polycentric development plan, and in some cases it's just, you know, cities well connected by transit, but in other, like Copenhagen, there are sub-centers within the region that are connected by high quality transit to downtown Copenhagen. No, we did not look at Canada specifically, but would assume that you'd find examples of that. I sort of have this. I did spend a little time in Toronto, and I think that's a Canadian city with polycentric development. So I think it's become a very widely accepted, even outside the United States, development paradigm. But I don't have much information on Canada.
yeah, the question also is really looking at, I guess, the differences in different places, and so, you know, feel free to comment on maybe the differences in the 28 that you looked at, that you have data, but and specifically like how to balance the development of downtown versus the more polycentric sort of multiple centers in maybe smaller areas versus larger areas. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it sure does. I will say a little something and then pass it on to Sadegh. I don't view them as mutually exclusive. Yeah, we obviously, living in Salt Lake, know Salt Lake best, and the fact that we are having just tons of development downtown in no way detracts from the idea of a center at 9th and 9th, or 15th and 15th, or Magna. You can have centers, subcenters with a dominant downtown. And so I don't see them as conflicting with one another. I think just naturally as regions grow, origins and destinations get in a monocentric development pattern, get farther and farther from each other. The trip from the distant suburb to downtown becomes a very long, typically auto trip. So subcenters emerge naturally as regions grow. And I'll turn this over to Sadegh for his thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Reid. And I think what's important is that these subcenters and the central business district or downtown, they need to be connected by high quality transit. Otherwise, if there is not good connection between these subcenters, this would not be qualified. Maybe it's not qualified to be called polycentric development. And just one more point about the previous question, polycentric development pattern, the idea is not something new. It was first introduced 90 years ago, and it is well developed and well planned in Europe, and it's at the city level, region, metropolitan regions, and even cross borders. And this is something that the idea is now being the dominant paradigm in the US, and I think there are many good examples that can a researcher can find from the European countries as well.
So we have a few questions really trying to dig into the data that you've collected and what it says about transportation outcomes. And so we have one question about the built environment variables, and I think this one's a little tricky, but what is the most important of these built environment variables to achieving desired transportation outcomes?
Well, they all have some impact on mode choice and VMT. I'm going to refer back to the 2010 paper where we quantified the impact of all the Ds. This was a JAPA paper. It was co-authored by myself and Robert Cervero. It's called Travel in the Built Environment, a meta-analysis, and it's my most highly cited paper. And the most important D from the meta-analysis was destination accessibility, regional destination accessibility. So it's how many jobs from any given point can you reach within 30 minutes by transit, 30 minutes by auto, or 10 minutes, 20 minutes by auto. That was the most important, and that's how it's defined in our work. Second most important was mixed use, having jobs within a small area. You know, for example, a traffic analysis zone, having jobs and housing available in that, and shopping, of course, in a small area, mixed use. Intersection density and percentage of four-way intersections, which are measures of design, were third. And interestingly enough, density in our original meta-analysis was less important than the others in studies that control for the other variables, the other D variables. So that was a surprise. Now, Mark Stevens has done a follow-up to our original study, which was also published in JAPA a couple of years ago. and he has found that density is more important than we found it was based on our roughly 70 studies of the D variables and their travel impacts, but they're all important. I think it's safe to say from the literature, all 5D are important variables.
We have a group of questions about, and I think that this, I'm not sure if that I followed exactly, but if this might be something that you excluded, but talking about, for example, employer or a university effect on a community. And so if you have a university larger than the traditional CBD of the community, how could you apply this study? And also thinking about an employer who maybe doesn't want to locate downtown.
Well, taking the second question first, that's the whole idea of polycentric development. Whether you're an employer or a household, you may not want to live downtown because rents are high, or because congestion is great, or parking is expensive, or whatever. So that's the rationale for polycentric development. So I mentioned downtown Sandy. If you want to live in the suburbs, but you ultimately want a more urban lifestyle, in time, hasn't happened yet, but in time, downtown Sandy, the Cairns district, will be a place where, for example, young singles might want to live if they are working in the suburbs rather than downtown, or just have a preference for a less urban lifestyle. Universities, it was a question university shopping malls, etc., large business parks was something we wrestled with. Should we consider those centers? And in the literature, vast majority of the literature defines centers in terms of mixed use, and is the University of Utah, which is huge, I think it's the second largest employer in this state, is it a center? And we decided to stick with the definition, as Sadegh described, of centers as having a mix of uses and mix of employment sectors. That was a decision we made based on the literature itself, which defines centers in that particular way. You could certainly argue that the University of Utah is a center. It wasn't, however, in our analysis of quantitative data.
Great. We have a question on the environmental and social indicators in evaluating the polycentric urban form. Is that something you can address?
I'm not sure what the question is. It may be that someone is thinking, well, yes, there are a lot of walk trips within centers. Over half of all the trips are walk trips in centers, and that's from the trip chaining analysis. For trip chains or tours that remain within centers, over half of them are walk trips. And maybe the person who's asking the question is wondering if that's because of socio-demographics rather than the built environment. Maybe you might say that lower income people live in centers, or young Gen Zs live in centers. And they're inclined to walk anyway, and that's something we did not account for. There's certainly if I'm getting this questioner's question right, there's certainly a lot of evidence of self-selection, that people, based on their socio-demographic characteristics, choose to locate in certain places that are higher in the D variables, as opposed to environmental determinism, where the built environment affects the choices. And we did not, in this particular study, distinguish between those two explanations for the fact there's so many walk trips in centers. We did not have the ability, having collected data from 28 different regions, to control for self-selection. We did and have already in our region, because there was a residential preference survey done as part of our last household travel survey. And so we know people's predispositions toward, for example, active modes of transportation, but we did not have that for other regions. Typically, we had it only for a few regions. So this particular study doesn't distinguish one explanation from the other, but just makes the point, whatever cause is, whatever effect is, you find a lot of walk trips in centers and much lower VMT per trip in centers than in non-centers. And I've never been convinced that the self-selection, and I hope that's what the question asker is getting at. I've never been convinced that that's such an important distinction. Even if self-selection, the predisposition of people to live in walkable places, is what's causing a lot of walking in centers, we still want to provide places for those people to live that meet their preferences for a walkable environment, even if that's even if the some of the people living in centers aren't going to be physically active and walk. We want those who want to live in those kinds of environments to have multiple places, and not just downtown, but in smaller centers. And I'm going to end with this. And if you really want to see good polycentric development, Portland, which is a model for many things, is terrific. It's got, as I recall, of course, it's got downtown Portland. It has 8 regional centers, and I think it's 31 or 2 town centers. And then, of course, TODs at a lot of the light rail stations now, and neighborhood centers across the entire region. So it's a great example of polycentric development. Washington, D.C. is also a great example of polycentric development. We may be in 20 or 30 years here in Salt Lake, and as I mentioned, first thing out of the gate, that is our regional vision, and it has buy-in from all of the communities that make up the Wasatch Front.
Thank you, Reid. You hit on probably 5 or 6 of the remaining questions. So I think we've done really well answering the questions we've received, and so I just want to be respectful of your time, and I want to say thanks so much for presenting, Sadegh, as well. It's been great. I know we had a webinar last year. We had one this year with you guys, and maybe next year as well. But yeah, we are continuing our monthly NITC webinars, so please look for them and sign up. All right, thank you. Have a great day.
Stay safe.